My hero was never supposed to be a hero. He was the villain in one of our earlier collaborations, and I never wrote him with the intention of ever redeeming him. And then we sit down, the four of us, we sat down and started working on the ideas for this anthology, A Season to Remember. And it quickly became clear to me that I was going to have to use him and redeem him. And I said, oh no, how am I going to do that? Because I kind of made him pretty cardboard and pretty unlikable, which is not unusual for me. I like to write unlikable characters, but he was more unlikable than normal. So it was a learning experience for me and a growing experience for me, and I came to actually really enjoy this character. So, and Ava loves him. So, without further ado, Fordingham, you look like you could use a drink. Viscount Daring made to clap a hand over Fordingham's shoulder, but stopped himself just before he made contact, most likely due to the frosty glare aimed squarely in his direction. Come, we'll play a hand of Buntam, get Fox together. Put a little life in your eyes. But little did Daring know that Tristan Cavendish, the fourth Earl of Fordingham, had no desire to get Fox, or play cards, or do anything else whatsoever with the Viscount tonight, or ever at all, for that matter. Whether it was possible to put a little life in his eyes or not was a matter Fordingham held in sincere doubt. He briefly passed his gaze over the entirely too jovial man, lifting a single eyebrow in practiced and perfected disdain, and then stoically returned his attention to the entryway to Godfrey House. Not tonight. Running off to the card room would be counterproductive. He was here tonight for one reason and one reason only, to compel his wayward brother Wesley to meet with him, by force if necessary. Doing so would require Fordingham to be present amongst the other revelers here at the soiree upon Wesley's arrival. It would be entirely too easy otherwise for the younger brother to learn of the elder's presence and subsequently make his escape, with Fordingham being none the wiser until it was too late. As that very thing had already happened in some manner or another twice since the little season began, Fordingham had no intention of allowing another opportunity to slip through his fingers. Daring, however, did not scamper off as he ought to have done after Fordingham's dismissal. Instead, he let out something which sounded distinctly like a chuckle. You can't think to stand there scowling all night. You'll scare off all the ladies. Fordingham turned the full weight of his aforementioned scowl upon the cloyingly affable gentleman who refused to leave him be, but did not deign to respond. The glare finally obtained the much sought-after success. Daring gave a twitchy inclination of his head and then left with no further interruption to Fordingham's solitary objective. With one hand, Fordingham reached up and adjusted his cravat. Not that such an adjustment was necessary. His cravat was perfectly knotted, as always. He would never have left the confines of his London home otherwise. Straightening the neckcloth simply gave him something to do other than stand stock still and stare with his oh-so-dreadful scowl at the other inhabitants of the room. Perhaps he would draw less attention if he weren't so thoroughly imperturbable, if he did something with himself. At least that was the reasoning he used within his own mind for his actions. Alas, adjusting the cravat took a mere moment to complete, and then he was yet again standing with his back to the wall, with his hands clasped behind him, and an impassive expression fixed upon his countenance. A few others drew close to him, including Godfrey, the host for the night's soiree. Fordingham paid none of them any mind, and soon enough they all left, just as everyone and everything in his life had always done. Finally, he saw Wesley, with his wife at his side, coming through the entryway. In atypical fashion, Fordingham actually noticed the chit first. Her dull brown hair and shy demeanor made her easy to recognize as the Pritchards' housemaid, who had been only too happy to aid Wesley's rapid descent into madness. Admittedly, that wasn't a fair assessment of her character. She was no longer a housemaid, but was now the wife of a gentleman. Fordingham had decided months ago to release the resentments he felt over Wesley's duplicity. In order to succeed in his endeavor, he would have to begin seeing Wesley's wife in the new light she'd recently acquired. Learning her name might be helpful in order to accomplish this objective, a realization which emphasized yet another thing over which Fordingham could hate his long-deceased father. The new Mrs. Cavendish might have been a mere servant once upon a time, but she was still a person, and people had names. Yet until recently, he'd never seen servants as people and had only seen fit to learn the names of those servants with whom he was most likely to be forced to interact. Much had changed in Fordingham's life of late. Then Wesley followed his wife through the door, all dark and devilish looking, just like the blackguard father had painted him to be so many years ago, an image Fordingham had only been too willing to allow his brother to maintain for quite some time. Too long. Fordingham took off across the room to meet them while Wesley and his wife were still involved with reading Lady Godfrey. If he caught them with members of the tone surrounding them all, surely they would stay long enough to hear him out without causing a scene. Just before he drew close enough to speak to them soft shouting, the woman looked up. Her eyes widened as they met his, and she tensed, no doubt alerting her husband to the fact that something was amiss. Wesley turned. Fordingham could tell the precise moment that recognition struck his brother. Wesley's eyes hardened to black slits, his jaw tensed, and he wrapped a protective arm around his wife's waist, nearly drawing her behind him in an overly familiar gesture for such a public gathering. So perhaps Wesley did intend to make a scene. Or perchance he simply hadn't thought through what he would do in such a circumstance. He had always been a bit hot-headed. Fordingham ought to have expected this very reaction. His brother had been avoiding him for a full week now, even instructing the servants to bar him from the townhouse the MBA had provided the new couple so that Wesley could pursue his political interests. Yet, oddly enough, this behavior still took Fordingham unaware. Mrs. Cavendish, he said as warmly as he could manage, though admittedly his tone was far from warm. He'd never been shown any affection, so how could he know how to give any in return? So good to see you here this evening. And you, brother. What do you want? Wesley barked in response. The slits of his eyes somehow narrowed further, a clear indication that his impending rage was preparing to be set forth. Fordingham shook his head slightly, taking Mrs. Cavendish by the elbow and guiding her into a more private alcove with the assurance that his brother would follow. He was wrong in his assumption. Wesley's hand came down over his, taking his fingers in a vice-like grip and forcefully removing them from Mrs. Cavendish's elbow. You will never touch my wife again if you value your life, Tris. It took every ounce of restraint he had not to counter Wesley's use of his Christian name with a reminder that he was Fordingham, and had been for some time now. Old habits and beliefs had been so fully beaten into him by his father, he wondered if he could ever truly be free of them. Moments like these left him feeling jealous of his brother for whatever reason. Jealous of despair? The commoner hell-bent on being a Whig revolutionary? It made no sense, particularly since father had beaten Wesley too. His beatings had been even more harsh and more frequent than those Fordingham had received. But the beatings seemed to have had no effect upon his brother. Not in the way they had upon Fordingham. No matter what father had wished him to believe and say and do, Wesley had kept his beliefs, done as he wished, remained fully and truly himself. But who was Tristan Cavendish? Tristan, the man, no longer existed. He'd been left behind so long ago there were no more remnants floating about in the effort. Only Fordingham remained, an unfeeling earl, resolutely alone in the world, a peer of the realm who valued his position above all, just as father had insisted upon. No matter how much had heretofore changed in his life, an immeasurable amount of change must still take place. Nevertheless, with as much cool detachment as he could muster, Fordingham relinquished his hold on Mrs. Cavendish and then eyed his brother for a moment before returning his gaze to the lady. I wish to speak with you, both of you, he added, before his brother could object to Fordingham wanting to speak with Wesley's bride alone. You will join me for supper tomorrow at Fordingham House. It's customary for invitations to be given as requests, Wesley grumbled, with more than just a hint of a threat coloring his words. And he was likely right. Politeness, customs, general courtesy. These were all things father had taught him to ignore, behaviors father had done his best to wash from Fordingham's person and toss out with the bathwater. The Earl of Fordingham misused commands, not requests, conferring his presence upon those below his station as an honor for them, one which is to be granted sparingly and with a great deal of forethought as to the potential consequences. But clearly that was the problem, or one of the problems at least. So he nodded curtly. Quite so. Would you both join me tomorrow for supper at Fordingham House? The change in Fordingham's tactics seemed to take Wesley thoroughly by surprise. His eyes lost their squint, widening in shock for the briefest of moments. Then he recovered himself long enough to growl, "Why?" Then it was Fordingham's turn for surprise. Mrs. Cavendish reached around from behind Wesley, placing her hand cautiously on his. He gentled instantly, losing all of the fight that had him bowed up before he looked lovingly down in her eyes. She gave him a slight, tremulous smile with an entreaty in her gaze, and then she turned to Fortingham. "We would be honored to join you, my lord." Wesley ground his jaw hard enough that the action was almost audible over the din of the soiree. He stared down at his wife, questioning her with a scowl, yet she did not cower beneath him. And then he nodded with a long exhalation, the same curt nod that Fortingham had long since perfected. There was at least one thing the two had in common other than their parentage. With any small amount of fortune, perhaps there would be more. "We'll be there." His lips twitched as he said it, surely agreeing to anything Fortingham had requested did not sit well with the younger brother. This discomfort did not stop Wesley from relenting to his wife's will, however. What would it be like to care so deeply for a woman that one would willingly do things one would rather gouge out one's eyes than do otherwise? Fortingham did not have long to ponder such anomalies. Mrs. Cavendish gave a brief curtsy, and then Wesley was stir away before they could say anything else. He stared after them, watching them disappear into the crush. When he could see them no longer, a woman stepped into the path they'd just vacated. A woman with a pair of eyes so clear and blue and luminous he was left shaken to the core. Fortingham had been certain he'd never see that particular shade again in his life after he'd left Greece. They were the color of the sea, clear enough that he felt he could see all the way down to the depths of her soul as he'd once seen the very floor of the ocean. He stood there, dumbfounded, as she started across the room. Toward him, of all people. Try as he might, Fortingham could not take his eyes from her. Her lush, near-black hair, her rich skin, so unlike anything he expected to find whilst surrounded by so many ladies with their pale English rose complexions. The soft, sloping curves of her hips and waist and breasts. She was a vision from a dream, a mirage beckoning him to drink from the pool, which did not exist, and she still directly before him. His heart stopped, and for what must be the first time in his life, he could not take a breath, until she smiled directly up at him, her full lips stretching almost seductively. Warmth billowed over him like sunrise over the Greek sea. Life flooded back into him so quickly it left him terrified. She leaned in close to his ear and whispered, "I should like for you to seek an introduction to me, my lord. Lady Marston is my chaperone tonight." At this moment in time, Fortingham would have done anything she wanted, just as Wesley would do anything his wife desired. This was not what he had bargained for in attending this soiree. For the first time in his life, Fortingham was absolutely, unequivocally terrified.